This is a Shmoo. I will spend the second half, probably more of the lecture, discussing the Shmoo, a very deep and important character. So today we are going to discuss class. Now, class is a term that you've all heard. It's become in recent years quite a popular term in political debate. You've all heard about the fate of the middle class in America, the problem of middle class tax cuts. The term middle class has become the sort of bread and butter way of talking about, quote, ordinary people. That particular use of the word class is only one of a variety in sociology. What I want to do here is contrast three different approaches to class, three different ways that this term gets deployed in the analysis of social inequality. Now, what's common to all of these notions is that class, in some way or other, is tapping economic inequality. It's a way of entering the world of material inequalities between people and talking about it in terms of class always signals that you're talking about economic inequality in one way or another. But in the vast language of sociology, there are three different ways in which that concept is anchored. The most familiar is the first, where class is identified with various aspects of individual attributes and conditions of life. People have all sorts of different attributes. I mean, if you just think about all the people you know, there's many different attributes that you can use to describe people. People have height, they have sex, they have intelligence, they have aesthetic qualities, they have different amounts of income, they have different religions. Some of these attributes are pretty superficial. Hair color is not a very important attribute in this society. Some of these attributes run very deep in the identities of people. Your sex matters a lot to most people. It's something which they identify with. They think of themselves as a man or a woman. This is a primary source of who they are. So we have lots of different attributes. Some of these attributes are distributed unequally. That is, some of these attributes have the character that you can have more or less of that attribute. Now, that's not true for all attributes. Religion isn't unequally distributed. You're one religion or another, or no religion. Height is unequally distributed, but it's not very important with respect to most aspects of life, unless you're a basketball player. But material conditions of life are something that are distributed unequally across people and which do matter to people tremendously. Some of these attributes that you have, you're born with. Some you acquire. Some, once you've got the attribute, you can't change it very easily. Others are quite unstable. Education, for example, is an attribute. Once you acquire an education, it's something that goes with you. But you can always acquire more education. So a person in the United States, one of the characteristics of the way people acquire education in this particular society is if you screw up in high school and drop out, and then in your late 20s get your act together and decide you screwed up as a teenager and you want to try again, it's possible in this society to get a GED, to go to a community college and then transfer to a university. And there are people who dropped out of high school and end up being doctors and lawyers and professors of sociology, I imagine. So education is an attribute which you acquire over your lifetime, which varies unequally across people. Some people have a lot, some people have little, but it isn't fixed. It's something which you can change. And one way that you might compare societies in these terms is in terms of how easy it is to change your education at different stages of your life. It's one of the ways that countries differ. Now, class, then, is a particular way, in this first usage, It's a particular way of thinking about the interconnection between individual attributes and the conditions of life in which they live. Education is often seen as the really pivotal individual attribute in the kind of society in which we live. How much education you have determines a lot, shapes a lot about the kinds of material conditions of life under which you'll live. And that interconnectedness between your acquisition of education and your acquisition of an income, which is a key aspect of the material conditions of life, that interconnection, if it's tight, is described as a class interconnection. If it's extremely loose, if your education really didn't matter for your income, if income was randomly distributed with respect to education, one would not then see education as part of class. Education becomes a class phenomenon in this first usage of the term class, because it's something which you acquire as an individual and which connects you to a material condition of life. In this particular conception of class, this particular use of the term class, the language of class, the categories that people use, tend to be things like upper class, upper middle, middle, lower class, and so on. The terms that identify class tend to be gradational. They are like rungs on a ladder, and they're meant to track the rungs on the ladder of these individual attributes. So this cluster of individual attributes and material conditions gets mapped onto a hierarchy that goes from top to bottom with relatively arbitrary points at which you demarcate the different gradations. That's the characteristic language with which this first way of using the term class is developed. One key aspect of this conception of class, of this individualistic approach to thinking about class, is that generally people who talk about class in this way see each person's class as completely independent of every other person's. Classes are not interconnected, they're simply descriptions of individual attributes. If you improve the class characteristics of some people, this does not have any implications for the class conditions of other people. So when people talk about the solution to poverty being simply giving more education to people, if only we could educate the poor, they would cease to be poor, that perspective says it doesn't matter what everyone else's education is. If your education improves, your life will improve, and therefore your class situation will improve. There's no causal interconnection between how well you do and how well other people do. These are simply independent descriptions. You can therefore change the class structure just by changing the attributes of persons. Now that may be very hard to do. I'm not saying that's a simple matter. It turns out to be not so easy to change the individual attributes of persons, but that's the target if you adopt this individualistic approach to class. So that's the first general approach. This, I would say, this individualistic view of class is probably the dominant one in popular understandings. When people just think about class, they're thinking in some kind of vague way about the connection between things like education and income. They're thinking about the way in which individual attributes get turned into standards of living. And that cluster is more or less how most people talk about class. And certainly when politicians talk about things like a middle-class tax cut, that's the implicit conception of class that they're using. The second concept of class is theoretically a more complicated one. This is the concept of class, I think, which one might say more or less is the dominant current within sociology. Most sociologists adopt one version or another of what can be called the opportunity hoarding conception of class. In the opportunity hoarding conception of class, there's a shift of focus from the attributes of persons to the characteristic of the social positions which they occupy. So think of it this way, that you have a population of people that have attributes, and you have a population of jobs that have attributes. The people get sorted into the jobs. Do we attach the concept of class to the population of people, or do we attach the concept of class to the characteristics of the jobs, the characteristics of the social positions that people occupy? In the opportunity hoarding concept of class, the emphasis is on the nature of the positions. In the individual attributes concept of class, the emphasis is on the attributes of the persons. The opportunity hoarding concept of class says that there's a whole range of social processes which are attached to jobs and positions, which have the character of excluding some people from access to those jobs. There's rules of the game. Remember how much importance I stressed on the notion of rules. There are rules of the game of acquiring a standard of living in our society, which attaches rules of entry to jobs, and which has the effect of excluding some people and including or allowing access to others. And the concept of class, then, is thought of as identifying those key mechanisms in the job structure that excludes or includes people. One example of this, which is a subtle example, it's not so simple, again, is education. So one thing that education does is create credentials, creates licenses. If you have that license, you have access to a job. Now, the license that you acquire should actually be thought of as an attribute of the job itself, because it's the rules about the job that determine that you need that license. You need a medical degree to get into the job of doctor. But that's an attribute of the job. The job says nobody can enter this job without that credential. That becomes a structural feature of the jobs themselves and not merely an attribute of the person. What a license does is excludes people. Now, any mechanism which excludes people from access to jobs then counts as one aspect of this opportunity hoarding or excluding process. Another mechanism for excluding people from jobs is property rights. The job, in quotes, the job of being an employer, of being a capitalist, of employing people, is restricted to those people who own the means of production. That gives you the right to fulfill the responsibilities of that job. Property rights are a mechanism of excluding people. If the workers in a factory go to work and take over the factory and say, we don't need the employer, we'll just run it ourselves, if they were to do so, the police would get sent in and they would be arrested. They would be arrested because they violate a mechanism, a principle of exclusion. They don't have the right to occupy that position, the position of directing and running the factory, because they aren't the owners of the factory. That's a very powerful mechanism of exclusion, one of the most important in our society, but it's not the only one. Credentials in education also have that character. Opportunity hoarding as a type of inequality, as a way of thinking about class, is an example of what can be called a relational concept of class. This is in contrast to the gradational concept of class that is characteristic of the... Is there some people are giggling. Is there a typo in there? No. Sometimes, happens. I have an embarrassing typo in a PowerPoint, and everybody recognizes it but me. Relational and gradational concepts of inequality are a way of thinking about these first two types. In a gradational concept, people are just arrayed on a ladder, and the names of classes capture that graded, gradational array of people, from upper to upper middle, 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 lower, 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 and so on. Those are all rungs on a ladder, that image of class. Relational concepts of class emphasize the character of the social relationships that bind together people in positions of advantage and disadvantage. Think of the category slave master. Let's take a really harsh class relation. The category slave master cannot be defined except in terms of a social relationship to the category slave. Right? So slave and slave master get their meanings from the relationship that tie them together. Employer and worker, or capitalist and worker. You can't define the category employee or worker outside of the category employer. They define each other because it's the relationship between the categories which is the heart of the definition. Husbands and wives. The category husband doesn't mean anything except via its relational connection to the category wife. So societies are made up of social relations in which the categories derive their names, which are qualitative names, not quantitative names. They're qualitative names, and the names come from the name of the relation. The marriage relation defines the husband-wife relation. The capitalist employment relation defines the capitalist-worker relation. Slavery defines the slave-owner-slave relation. These are all relational forms of inequality, and opportunity hoarding is the standard way that sociologists think about these social relations. In opportunity hoarding, the social relations are defined by the ways in which one position within a relation excludes access to that relation, to that position, to other positions in the relation. It's relations of exclusion that are being defined by the class structure. That's the second concept of class. Now, the third concept of class is certainly the most controversial. Well, I think, regardless of whether you're drawn to this approach to class, it's extremely interesting. And it's the one that I want to spend some time on. It's the concept of class around which my own research and theoretical writing about class has been primarily built. I want to explain the concept of exploitation and domination through a story that features this character. This wonderful creature is called a shmoo. S-H-M-O-O. Shmoo. The shmoo was invented by an American comic strip writer from the 1930s to the 1960s named Al Capp, who was the inventor of Little Abner. They lived in the town of Dogpatch in Arkansas, in the Ozark Mountains. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the story of the shmoo, which may seem to have absolutely nothing to do with sociological concepts, and then use this story as a way of giving content to the notion of exploitation. This third concept of class is built around these two ideas, exploitation and domination. These are harsh terms. These are morally charged terms. If I say, nobody stands up and says, "Yay, I'm an exploiter, isn't it great?" You know, nobody self-defines their relationship to other people as being exploitative. Even domination, you know, that's not quite as harsh a moral term as as exploitation, but even domination. People might say, I'm in authority, but not, I'm a dominator. Domination has this morally charged, critical indictment implied in it. So to import these terms, to use these terms in a sociological account of class, is to infuse the discussion with some moral charge, to make the issues of the nature of these relations not merely descriptive, but also having a critical character. And what I'd like to do is to give you an account of these concepts that helps make sense of that kind of critique of particular social relations. I'll use the story of the Shmoo to do so. So the Shmoo is a mutation of some pre-Shmoo critter that lived in the Ozark Mountains. According to Al Capp, the Army after the Second World War dumped radioactive waste in the mountains of the Ozarks, and some pre-Shmoo was mutated into a Shmoo. I think it was a wild turkey. I mean, if you look at this guy, it seems like it could have been a... Well, what's special about the Shmoo? The Shmoo has a number of powers. First of all, the Shmoo has one purpose in life, which is to make people happy. They are dedicated to our well-being. Secondly, they're telepathic. They can read your minds. They know what you want. Third, they have this extraordinary ability to turn themselves into the things that you need. And fourth, they replicate themselves before they do so. So if you wake up in the morning and you're hungry and you want an omelet, the Shmoo becomes an omelet. But first replicates itself. If you want a bowl of caviar, it won't do it. That is, it will provide for basic necessities. In Dogpatch, those are pretty basic because their tastes are pretty primitive, pretty limited, I should say. The Shmoo provides you with your basic needs without having to work for it. Because it replicates itself, you never run out of them. The Shmoo restores humanity to the Garden of Eden, precisely in this rigorous sense. What the Shmoo does is give you all of your basic needs without the sweat of your brow. And it's interesting to think about what life would be like if we actually had Shmoos. Well, what I want to show you is how the particular story of the Shmoo in Little Abner helps us to understand the problem of exploitation.
And now, P.U., we're coming to a spot where folks are so ignorant they'd never dream of asking for more than we're willing to pay. And they'll never get rich on that. Here they haven't been spoiled by that silly fad of working a mere 8-hour day. These miserable rats are in such desperate need that they'll work for a good old-fashioned 16-hour day. You're a bright boy. How did you find such a splendid spot to move our factory? Statistics show that there are more undernourished people in Dogpatch than any place. Those are the kind I like to deal with. They're so grateful, bless them. These poor, ignorant wretches will be grateful for the chance to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, for $7 a week. They've never heard of anything better, and we'll never tell them. Oh, you're a bright lad. The board may well give you a bonus of $500,000 again this year. An aside, this is 1947, $500,000. Adjusted for inflation in 2010 dollars, this is probably a $10 million bonus, maybe even more. I don't know what the ratio of dollars in 1947 to the present are. A substantial bonus for finding Dogpatch. Back to the story. But maybe we can pay him even less. Question one of them. How would you like to earn $7 a week? Did you say $7 for just 1 week? No, I said 6. That would have been a mighty juicy proposition before BS. What do you mean, BS? Before schmooze. Only 18 hours of hard labor a day? Only 7 days a week? And you'd pay us $6 for just that? That ought to be a mighty juicy proposition, BS. Meaning before schmooze. But nobody what's got schmooze has to work anymore, and anybody can have them for free. Schmooze does everything. Everything? Oh, I suppose they provide you with the necessities of life. Milk, butter, eggs, meat. Stop laughing, you fool. Look. Great Scott, P.U. Do you realize what the Shmoo means? Nobody will have to work hard anymore. But who'll do the long, dreary, back-breaking labor at our canning factories? I'd like to take another pause. Now, I want to make note of a very subtle theoretical difference between the account of the schmooze being provided by the resident of Dogpatch and the account of the consequences of the shmoo being provided by P.U. and his henchmen, right? So both the employer, prospective capitalists, and the workers, they have an account of what the consequence of the shmoo is. If we go back to the previous evidence, let's see, the guy in Dogpatch says, and I'm quoting him directly here, he says, quote, "But nobody what's got schmooze has to work anymore." So the Dogpatch resident's conclusion is, if you've got a shmoo, you don't have to work. That is, what the shmoo does is break the relationship between the employer and the worker. The worker doesn't have to go to work, right? That's the Dogpatch resident's diagnosis. But the manager says something a little different. What he says, "Great Scott, P.U., do you realize what the shmoo means? Nobody will have to work hard anymore." So the employer, or the manager in this case, he thinks, aha, if people have a shmoo, it's going to be harder for me to get them to work hard. The Dogpatch resident says, I won't have to go to work at all. Now that's an important distinction. That's an important distinction. The Dogpatch resident sees the shmoo as breaking what could be called the exchange relationship between the employer and the worker. The worker doesn't have to sell labor to the employer. They don't have to go to work. The employer recognizes, well, people might still want to go to work because they want income to buy things other than bread, milk, and eggs, to buy things beyond necessity. The shmoo, remember, only provides you basic necessities. But it's going to be hard to get them to work hard anymore. It's going to be hard to control them. It's going to be hard to extract effort from people if they have the option of leaving work and living on the shmoo alone. So to use the kind of technical language, the employer is worried about exploitation. The employer is worried about the ability to extract effort from someone, whereas the Dogpatch resident is only thinking about opportunity hoarding. That is, that having a shmoo means that it no longer will matter that the opportunity is being hoarded by the employer because I don't have to work anymore. Well, back to the drama. Great Scott, P.U., do you realize what the shmoo means? Nobody will have to work hard anymore. But who will do the long, dreary, back-breaking labor at our canning factories? Nobody, and what's worse, nobody will need our canned stuff anymore. The shmoo provides all kinds of food, all types of food, fresh and free. Free food for everybody. That's horrible. The shmoo must go. It's either it or us. Thank heavens its sinister influence hasn't spread yet. Blast you, Wormley, why are you stopping? Because I've quit. I snuck a brace of shmoos under my coat and Dogpatch. Now I've got a whole herd of them. I'll never have to take your guff anymore, P.U. The shmoo has implications aside from just Dogpatch. It means that a person no longer has to submit to the domination of someone else. Taking guff is a kind of metaphor for being bossed around by a powerful
person to whom you are subordinate. So the driver of the car is liberated from domination, not just from exploitation because of the shmoo. Back in New York,
I'll forget the Shmoo menace by taking Choo-Choo to dinner. That poor showgirl has been unemployed so long, she'll even go out with me for a square meal. Oh, I'd love to go to dinner with you, honey pot. I'll get you a big steak, and you can take that steak and slap your own fat face with it. There's good schmooze tonight.
Now, well, I want to focus on the class aspect of the story, how the shmoo informs the actions of the residents of Dogpatch and the employer, and what this tells us about the problem of exploitation and domination. And I have a question I want to pose to you. Give you 3 or 4 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves. And here's the question. So you might want to take note of the question. Let's imagine that actually shmoos suddenly descended upon the United States. They came like manna from heaven. Come out and we all suddenly have shmoos. Let's imagine that there are 4 possible things that could happen to these shmoos. Everybody gets a shmoo. Only the rich gets the shmoo. Only the poor get the shmoo. And nobody gets a shmoo. Those are 4 possibilities. So the shmoos arrive, and you have to decide which of these 4 possibilities would be your top priority. If that's not possible, what's the second, what's the third, and what's the fourth? Now, what I want you to discuss is the following. If you are PU, if you're the employer, the would-be employer, the capitalist and his henchman, if you're these 2 guys, what's your rank ordering of the fate of the shmoo? What would be the best thing that would happen? The second preference, the third, and the fourth. So we have these 4 possibilities, rank them from 1 to 4. And also do the same ranking for the residents of Dogpatch. If you're the poor citizens of Dogpatch, what's your first preference, second preference, third preference, and fourth preference? Okay?
Now, there are 4 fates for the shmoo, 4 things that can happen to the shmoo. Everybody can get a shmoo. Nobody gets it. Destroy the shmoo. Only the poor get it. Only the working class, only the people who need it most get it. Or only the people who are already advantaged get it. Right? So with 2 classes, and the shmoos either exist or don't exist, there are these 4 possibilities. Everybody gets it, nobody gets it, the rich get it, the poor get it. Now let's ask, what's the rank ordering of preference of each of these classes? If you ask somebody in the first class, what would you like to see most happen to the shmoo? And if that's not possible, what's second and third and fourth? And you're only allowed to think about what's good for you. You know, you can't be a rich person who really deeply cares about the poor. You're just caring about yourself. So we're asking for your selfish interests. This doesn't imply that wealthy people are always selfish in this way. No, there are many who are extremely benevolent. It's just saying, what would be your class interests? Class interests mean the interests that benefit you, per se, period. Not interests that are take into consideration the well-being of others. So what's the rank ordering for the capitalist class? Well, their first choice would be only capitalists get the shmoo, because after all, capitalists eat oatmeal. So a rich person is slightly better off if they have a shmoo than if they don't have a shmoo. Their second choice is destroy the shmoo. If they can't keep it exclusively for themselves, they would rather that nobody get it. The third choice is everybody gets a shmoo. Well, if you can't destroy them and you can't monopolize them, well, you might as well have everybody get them, because then at least you get them as well. And the worst option is only those who need them the most get it. That's at the bottom of the list. Well, what about workers? What's their first choice? Well, this isn't quite so obvious as for the capitalists, but their first choice is actually that everybody gets a shmoo. The reason is this. Many workers will actually want to still work. They will want to earn an income because, remember, the shmoo only provides for basic needs. It restores you to the Garden of Eden. You don't have to earn your bread by the sweat of your brow, but you will have to earn your airplane ticket to go to the Bahamas for a nice summer vacation by the sweat of your brow. So any worker who wants discretionary income, wants to live above basic needs, will have to earn an income. And all things considered, it's better to work for a capitalist who has a shmoo than one who doesn't. Because a capitalist with a shmoo will be a richer capitalist, have a little more flexibility, and so the wages in a firm in which the owners also have shmoos are likely to be a little bit higher. So first choice is everyone gets a shmoo. Second choice is only workers get the shmoo. Third choice is only the rich get the shmoo. That is, workers would still be better off if the capitalists didn't have to spend money on oatmeal, because that would mean there'd be a little bit more income available by the owner when you bargain for wages. They would have a little bit more flexibility because they have more resources. And the worst option is destroy the shmoo. The worst option is destroy the shmoo. Now look at these two rank orderings. This is one way then of thinking about a class relation and the nature of the antagonism of interests that are bound together in that kind of relationship. These are not just different rank orderings, they're pretty sharply opposed rank orderings. You know, it's hard to imagine something more antagonistic. Antagonistic means there's a kind of intrinsic opposition, not just because of some misunderstanding or because of excessive greed. No, this is built into the character of the relationship itself. Very sharp conflict. But note another thing. If you were to ask some great moral leader how they would rank order the fate of the shmoo, you know, think of the great moral figures of history. Martin Luther King, Jesus, Buddha, you know, any of the powerful moral figures that humanity has respected for their moral judgment. I think their rank ordering would be pretty much the same as the rank ordering of the poor in this story. I mean, they would say if this great boon from heaven is possible, everybody should get it. And if it can't go to everybody, at least those who most desperately need it should get the boon, the manna from heaven. And if that's not possible, well, perhaps reluctantly, only the wealthy should get it, because at least some of that will trickle down, to use a favorite expression of the modern era, to the poor. And the worst option would be to destroy it on universalistic moral principles. Well, that's a pretty interesting coincidence that the selfish rank ordering of the disadvantaged in these relationships also corresponds to a kind of universal, non-selfish rank ordering that would conform to moral principles. All right, so this is the first big step. We've gone from saying that when workers go into employment, they are dominated. That's kind of obvious. That the social relation into which they enter is one of domination. We've now added a more complex idea. They enter a relationship that has this kind of fraught interdependency and conflict of interests, which I'm labeling exploitation. Now I'm going to ratchet this up to one more level of abstraction. So we're now building this concept in a more complex way. This involves specifying 3 criteria for giving now real precision to the concept of exploitation. These criteria come out of the Shmoo story, but really go beyond it. Now, this is pretty abstract and pretty complicated. It's not, I think, opaque. It's not that you can't understand it, but if this is the first time you've grappled with these kinds of ideas, don't feel uncomfortable that it doesn't all quite fit together. In the reading for the class, I don't go through this level of detail in the book. What I'm presenting to you here is the ideas that I've developed in my kind of most theoretical writing around the problem of class. But I generally have the view that there's no reason not to share the most sophisticated versions of arguments, even in an introductory class like this, and even if it doesn't all get absorbed, because that's how you learn. You learn by getting things that are just a little bit beyond where you can fully grasp and integrate it into your own thinking, so that the next time you encounter ideas, they become more familiar. All right, so there are 3 criteria that define this package that we call exploitation. The first is called the inverse interdependent welfare principle. This is a situation where the material well-being of the advantaged group causally depends upon the material deprivations of the disadvantaged. So there's an interdependence of the well-being of the capitalist and the worker, the rich and the poor in the Shmoo story. They're interdependent. But the well-being of the advantaged group causally depends upon the deprivations of the disadvantaged. There's a causal connection. They are well off because the poor are badly off. These aren't independent descriptions. Now you can see the grasshopper and the ant story doesn't satisfy this. The ant is not well off because the grasshopper is badly off. The grasshopper is badly off because the grasshopper was lazy in the summer. That's why the grasshopper was badly off, not because of any relationship. There's no inverse interdependence of the well-being. That's the first criterion. The second criterion is called the exclusion principle. The causal relation in A that we've just described, the causal relation involves the exclusion of the disadvantaged group from access to certain important productive resources controlled by the advantaged group. Certain important resources. So that's when the Shmoo becomes part of the story. The advantage of the employer depends upon excluding the potential worker from access to the Shmoo. They have interdependent welfare. There's a causal connection, but that causal connection is tied to the exclusion. That's an opportunity hoarding idea, right? Exclusion from access to a resource. That's the exclusion principle. The final principle is called the labor effort control principle. This can also be called the appropriation principle, if you want to use a fancier word. The causal mechanism which translates B, that is exclusion, into condition A, that is negative inverse interdependent well-being. The causal mechanism which translates condition B into condition A involves the control over the labor effort and the profits from that effort of the disadvantaged group by those who control these productive resources. That is, remember my little allusion to the dog patch person being a Weberian and the capitalist being a Marxist? Well, what this refers to is the ability to appropriate the effort of others by virtue of their exclusion from this important resource. What the employer is worried about is that if Shmoos exist, workers won't work hard anymore. And if workers won't work hard anymore, they won't have control over the labor effort and the profits from that effort of the disadvantaged group. They won't work hard anymore. If you have the first two conditions but not the third, you have what can be called non-exploitative oppression. If you have all three, you have exploitation.